Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, I spoke with Christina Lamb, who is Chief Foreign Correspondent of the Sunday Times.
Christina spoke about her early experience as a freelancer covering conflict in Afghanistan. She talked about co-writing Malala's biography and how she balances her time as a journalist and an author.
It's a great episode and we really hope you enjoy it. So I'm here with Christina Lamb at the Jaipur in London Literary Festival. Christina, great to have you here and thanks so much for finding time at the end of a long day.
It's a pleasure.
I was wondering if we could kind of dive right in. Thanks again for sending over those stories. And if you could talk about this wedding in Pakistan. So the wedding that kind of threw you into journalism, or was your entry? It was a Bhutto wedding, was it?
Yeah, my whole career as a foreign correspondent basically started as a result of a wedding invitation.
Okay.
I'd always wanted to write. I loved writing. I hadn't necessarily thought about being a journalist.
Yeah.
Really wanted to write novels. And at university, I got involved in journalism and edited the university newspaper. But when I left university, my plan was to spend a year or so doing different things and trying to make some money so that I could then go and rent a garret somewhere and write my great novel. But I thought I needed to have exciting adventures happen to me to write about.
Right.
And I worked as an intern for the Financial Times when I first left university, and I was on the foreign desk. And one day, the foreign editor was supposed to go for a lunch of South Asian politicians, and last minute couldn't go. And he said to me, "You're always going on about India," because I'd travelled there as a student. So why don't you go to this lunch? So I went and sat next to somebody who was the Secretary General for the Pakistan People's Party, which was Benazir Bhutto's party, opposition. And at that time, Pakistan was under military dictatorship. So this man asked me if I'd like to interview Benazir.
Okay.
And she was living in exile in London. Of course, I said yes. So I ended up going to interview her. And the day that I interviewed her was the day that she announced her engagement to Asif Ali Zardari.
Okay.
So her flat was just full of bouquets of flowers.
So this is 86?
This was 87, actually.
Okay.
And I then got a job as a trainee at Central News in Birmingham.
Which was is that TV?
TV, yeah, which was a kind of accident, really, because I didn't really want to go into TV. But I met somebody who told me that they were looking for trainees, and then I went for an interview, and it seemed like fun. But it was a very male newsroom, to be honest, and I was the most junior person, and I spent an awful lot of time doing what I think is the worst job in journalism, which is we had a lot of motorways in our area because we covered all Midlands and some of Northern England, and there were a lot of motorway crashes, and so I would be the one, as the young girl, be sent to the families of who lost their sons or daughters or husbands, and to go and ask for a photograph that we could use with the story, and which I think is a really difficult thing to do.
Yeah.
So one day, anyway, I was there working there, and I came home from work, and there was this most beautiful gold inscribed wedding invitation on my doormat, and that was to Benazir's wedding in Pakistan, which was around Christmas 1987. So of course I said yes. And I had never been to Pakistan, and it was the most amazing introduction. It was so colourful but also so political, because every day of the wedding, and the wedding went on for like a week or more, like all South Asian weddings, but being Benazir, even more spectacular. And then every night after all the ceremonial events, there'd be these discussions with her political colleagues about how to try and topple General Zia, the military dictator. And I'd never heard anything like that. I mean, I'd kind of taken democracy for granted, I suppose. And suddenly I was meeting these people who had been tear gassed or tortured, arrested, not that much older than me, some of them, all trying to bring democracy back to their country. So I was fascinated and couldn't quite imagine going back to cover local news in Birmingham. So I came back and gave it my notice and went to live in Pakistan.
If you hadn't done that, if you'd stayed in the UK, how do you think your career would have unfolded?
I think I would have always gone somewhere because I was very restless. And actually, I'd had this idea before I got this traineeship at Central that I was going to go and work for the Bangkok Post. Okay. I'm not quite sure how the Bangkok Post, I think I wrote, because this was before internet and everything, I wrote them a letter saying like I was coming, but I don't think I ever had a reply.
Right. And then how did you go about setting yourself up as a young freelancer in Peshawar?
Well, to be honest, I didn't know anything about how journalists worked. I mean, I had worked on the foreign desk at the FT for that summit, so I had seen from that end and had met some of the foreign correspondents. And I suppose, to me, they were such romantic figures. They were almost entirely male, I have to say. They came wafted back from wherever they were based, Beirut or Damascus or all these places that seemed very romantic to me. And they all came in they all seemed to carry sort of big leather satchels full of lots of newspapers in different languages. And they just looked much more exotic and interesting than anyone else. So I wanted to be like that.
Now that you've done the trade yourself, how real do you think the romanticism was, and do you think there was an element of affectation to the leather satchels and things like that?
They probably liked the fact that there was this sort of 21-year-old girl who was kind of fascinated by what they were doing, and because to be honest, they were really all quite jaded characters, I would say, but they just knew all about different things in the world and had been to all these places and were kind of covering these great stories, and I was completely intrigued by it and wanted to be like that. So but I suppose I had failed to really ask them any of the specific questions that would have been more useful of what you should do when you get to a place, or and so actually I kind of got on the plane. This sounds really silly looking back, but got on the plane to Pakistan, to Rawalpindi, with actually not a clue what I would do when I got there. But I'd got to know the press attaché at the Pakistan High Commission, who was a really lovely man. And I think he was a little bit baffled at the idea of this 21-year-old blonde girl going off to live in Pakistan on her own, who didn't really seem to know very much. And he wrote me in the most beautiful black copper plate writing letters to people to give when I got there, to like introductions. And it almost felt like something out of Kipling, turning up with these letters into Peshawar and the Northwest Frontier. And actually, the very first letter that I went to talk to somebody was from the Arbab family. And that was a fantastic introduction, because at that point the Arbabs controlled most of the city, like the mayor, the refugee commissioner. At that time there were 3.5 million Afghan refugees in Pakistan. It was a typical Pakistan well-off family where you had somebody in a government position, somebody in the army, a banker, it kind of covered all bases, a civil servant. And so they were really helpful and incredibly kind to me.
So how do you get from there, from being fresh off the plane to being embedded with the Mujahideen, 6 months later? What's the
No, much quicker than that. I mean, the thing to do, the whole point of being in Peshawar was to cover the war in Afghanistan. And actually, I hadn't gone out there. My plan when I came back from Pakistan and said I'm going to go and live there was to cover Pakistan. I thought Benazir had gone back and she was going to topple the military dictator, and I was going to cover this kind of revolution. When I went to talk to foreign editors, they all looked at me as though I was mad and very naive, which I suppose I was. And they weren't interested in Pakistan. They all said General Zia's been there 11.5 years, nothing's going to change. But they were interested in Afghanistan because at that time the Russians were there.
8 years.
They'd been there since 79, so it was end of 87, early 88. So they told me, if you want to cover Afghanistan, we're interested. And Afghanistan was a war that was mostly covered by freelancers, because it's odd looking back on that now, given all the other things that have happened. But mostly people didn't send their staff correspondents into Afghanistan. So there was sort of group of us, because it was considered very dangerous, actually, a group of us living in Peshawar who used to go in and out. And so that was the whole point of being there, really, was to go in and out with the Mujahideen, going inside, we called it.
Right.
And you spent all your time in Peshawar basically trying to go inside with a group, find a group that were going somewhere interesting. And then when you were inside, it was really miserable. There was nothing to eat. You were dodging, kind of being bombed. There were landmines. Often there was long periods, and this is one of the things about war, long periods with nothing going on, actually. And, you know, often the Mujahideen wouldn't get up for hours, and so you were going to be hanging around. And so you'd often, once you got inside, then you were wishing that you were back out again. But I guess when I got there, like I said, I didn't know what foreign correspondents did or what they needed. And there were 7 different Mujahideen groups that had been created really by Pakistan's intelligence, ISI, which was controlling the whole war. Yeah. And they followed the whole British divide and rule system. And so if there was lots of groups, they could play them off against each other. And why they had power was lots of money and arms came mostly from CIA, also from the Saudis, also from the British and French. But because it was a covert war against the Russians, and this was really the last proxy war of the Cold War, the Pakistani military ran the whole thing. And so they had a lot of power. And of course, what became clear later was that they were using this to empower the people that most followed what they wanted, which tended to be the really hardline jihadists, the Islamist groups.
Did the Russians still have ground troops on the ground?
Yes, they did. They did. But I went there at the time when the tide was starting to turn. And it was starting to turn because the huge advantage that the Russians had over the Mujahideen was air power. Obviously, the Mujahideen didn't have anything. Then, just before I got there, was when the Mujahideen had been given Stinger missiles and blowpipes, which meant that they could shoot down helicopters, and that made a huge difference. That really turned the tide of the war.
And could you talk about this story that you sent, which was for the FT, was it? So how did it come about, and then how did you file and things like that? At that time?
Yeah, well, that was a huge difficulty at that time.
We'll put this in the show notes so that the people can see.
So what happened was I used to go in and out of Afghanistan, and I was freelancing for various people. So I regularly for the FT. But, you know, the FT is a mostly business newspaper. There was a limit to their appetite of stories from inside the war in Afghanistan. And also I used to work for all sorts of people, Time Magazine, Daily Express. I was their hour girl in Kabul. So, you know, different groups of people, even did some TV too. And I went into Kandahar, which was actually a hard place to go to. Mostly we tended to go to places that were quite easy, like Jalalabad or Khost, or places that didn't take so long to get to from Peshawar. But Kandahar was a much longer trip, and I had really wanted to go there because it seemed to me very interesting that the Mujahideen in Kandahar were different. They were more independent, less under the control of the Pakistani intelligence. And I had met somebody called Hamid Karzai, who at that time, as I said, because I didn't really know what foreign correspondents did, I went to see all 7 of the different Mujahideen groups. And most people didn't bother doing that. They just went to the most important, most effective. And I went to the smallest group, which was run by somebody called Professor Mujadidi, and the spokesperson for that was one Hamid Karzai, who at that time was completely unheard of outside of Afghanistan.
Because he spent time in the West later.
Later. Yeah. And so we got on very well. I learned a lot about what I know about Afghanistan from him, because right from the moment I met him, he said to me, if you want to understand Afghanistan, you need to understand the tribes of southern Afghanistan. Okay. So he invited me to his house for dinner, and it was full of all these bearded Afghan elders from Nimruz and Helmand and Kandahar and Zabul, and they all told the most amazing stories, mostly which seems to involve killing people. Right. And I'd never heard such stories. The Afghans are amazing storytellers, and they love having a captive audience, which they had from me.
Did you speak any local languages?
No, not then. Later I learnt some Pashto because I needed to, travelling, although I couldn't afford an interpreter. But at the beginning I didn't speak anything. And so anyway, Hamid Karzai and I became good friends. I would say actually he became my closest friend in Peshawar. And he had not gone into Afghanistan at all. He'd been a spokesperson, so on the sort of political side. But he really wanted to go and actually experience what it was like being in the jihad in Afghanistan. So he was going to go to Kandahar on a trip. So he took me with him on that trip. So we went for 3 weeks. And we went with a group called the Mullahs Front, which actually was a very independent group. And as the name suggests, was a kind of religious-based group. They'd never had a journalist with them before, certainly never a woman. And we drove round for 3 weeks around Kandahar on the backs of their motorbikes.
Did you wear a headscarf? Did you cover up?
I actually wore a turban because we were supposed to look like Kandahari tribal people. And actually I can tell you that it's a lot more risky sometimes being dressed as a Kandahari boy than it would be as a woman, because Kandahari tastes tend to be more in that direction sometimes. So I travelled around with them, and we kept being bombed everywhere we went. And Hamid Karzai, each place we got to, because he was excited to be there, would radio immediately, like everybody around, to say, I'm here and let's meet. So all these people would come, and then we would get bombed. After this happened, like sort of 5 days running in different places, I said to him, do you think it's really such a good idea to keep radioing, like where? Because he was on the top of the Soviet hit list. He was one of the people they wanted to get. His father had been an important politician, and so we had a very interesting time. And we were with this group that then decided that they were going to attack Kandahar city and try and capture some posts. At that time, it was still under Russian control. And so we went on this mission, which it just seemed crazy to me. So first we went and we attacked a post and started firing all sorts of things at it. And of course, in the middle of the night, and they immediately fired loads of things at us, and they had much more than we did. So we then had to run like hell to get out. So that didn't really work very well. Then they decided they were going to attack the airport, which was
Had you been in that kind of situation before?
Well, I had been in Afghanistan by then. When that trip happened, I suppose I'd already been there maybe 6 months or so. So I had been on some other missions with different Mujahideen group, but this was the hardest and the longest period, really. And also, as I said, sometimes you'd go and you wouldn't see anything. So we were always a bit suspicious because...
Was it just you? Or
yeah, it was just me. No, I never travelled with any other journalists. Because usually these groups anyway would only take one journalist with them. But we were always very suspicious, those of us based in Peshawar, that sometimes when people came out from London or from America with sort of big names would come and they'd go on one trip into Afghanistan for a few days and then come out and write some huge story about this massive battle.
Do you think they were making stuff up?
Well, I have no idea.
Or do you think stuff was being put on for
what we knew was that usually when you travelled with the Mujahideen, you often spent a lot of time and nothing happened, because this is a guerrilla war, right? You didn't know.
Sure.
I honestly believe that one of the reasons the Russians found it so difficult to defeat the Afghans and ultimately didn't was because it was so disorganized. You know, they had no idea. They couldn't predict what the Afghan Mujahideen were going to do, because Mujahideen didn't know what they were going to do. But also, of course, as our troops then discovered later on, you know, it's a huge disadvantage to not know the terrain and the obviously,
and the cultural terrain.
The Mujahideen, you know, it was their country, so they.
So
knew.
how did you then file?
So, so this particular attack, then we attacked the airport, and that was kind of mad because how could we were a small group of Mujahideen firing on the Russians at the airport. So immediately they sent tanks back down and started firing at us, and all of the fighters that were in a sort of building for drying grapes just behind us, that was blown up, so they were all killed. The rest of us were in a kind of trench down below, a big ditch. And so we survived, but then these tanks were there, so we couldn't get out of the trenches, because if we had moved, we would have been shot. And they just didn't move, so we were then stuck for ages. So we were 2 days in these ditches, and there's nothing to eat, and the ditches were muddy, so there was actually some crabs in them, and so the Mujahideen ate these mud crabs. I didn't eat those, but I did drink the muddy water, and it was, the whole thing was just mad. Eventually the tanks left and we were able to get out, but I couldn't file anything because this was before the days of satellite phones and mobile phones, and actually there was no phone service in Afghanistan then, so everything was through Pakistan. So I had to then wait until I came back to Pakistan, and even in Pakistan there was no direct dialing internationally, so I had to then call the international operator, and often that involved bribing the international operator, and then get a call through and then dictate copy, or the other way was through telex with ticker tape and putting that through. But, you know, it was really, so it was often weeks after something had happened before I actually was filing the story.
And so with that one, how long was the lag before it ran?
I can't remember exactly. It certainly would have been, it certainly would have taken us quite a long while to have got out of Kandahar back to Quetta. And I actually had mortar burns from the attack. So I had to go to the hospital and have this sort of mercury ointment, which I'm sure is completely banned now.
Or mercurochrome or something like that.
And so I guess I must have filed from Quetta, but it was a long while afterwards. It's interesting for me. I just looked at that piece today before we talked, and I haven't read it for a long while. And this is a piece from 1988. And it was part of a group of pieces for which I won Young Journalist of the Year. And it's so interesting because the piece is almost entirely third person. It's not, and it it's quite factual. Okay, bear in mind it was for the Financial Times, but these days I think someone in that position would be writing very much about, me, what happened, and my feeling. There's none of that really in that piece. And actually, here I was, a sort of 21-year-old girl in a ditch with Russian tanks facing on me, which I still, remember quite vividly. And yet that's written in quite a dispassionate way, which in some ways I think these days I feel that there's too much of people putting themselves in the story.
We always ask everyone on the podcast about the financial side of their writing lives. And so when you were a young freelancer on the hustle in Peshawar, were you making it work financially?
At the beginning, it was very difficult. I always say to young people that are looking for a place to go, find somewhere cheap and somewhere nice to live. And Peshawar was very cheap to live. And in those days, it was, I thought it was a wonderful place to live. It's very different now. But it was a struggle because, I mean, first of all, just the whole communications thing, it cost me a lot of money to make a phone call. And so to go through international dialing to make this call, relatively, phone calls were so much more expensive than they are now. And then often I would get through, it would take me so long to get through, and then I'd get through to the foreign editor and be told, oh, he's at lunch. And then that was quite soul destroying, because then, you kind of had gone to all that effort. And I mean, actually, my first big story when I was there was when General Zia was killed in an air crash. And when that happened, it was evening. And I remember I was at a friend's house, and it was the old Bakelite phones with the rotary dials. Yeah. And I was dialing the international operator's number, which I think was 123, over and over again, not getting through. And finally I got through and was begging her to get this number in London to the foreign desk. It took so long. I think it took an hour to get the number. And I was almost in tears by the end, because I was thinking, I'm like one of the only foreign correspondents here. This is a huge story. The whole General Zia was killed, the American ambassador, all the top-ranking generals practically were in this plane, had all been killed, and I can't get a phone call through.
Yeah. Were you then taken on to staff after that? What was your kind of personal progression after those?
So to start with, I was just freelancing, and as I was there for a while and started sort of picking up more strings, and actually, to be honest, in the end, more work than I could do. So it did end up well, but in the end, I was deported from Pakistan because I wrote a story about the military intelligence. So I wrote two things: one about them selling the weapons to the Iranians that were meant for the Afghan Mujahideen, and another about them plotting a coup against Benazir, who by then had become prime minister. And so I was deported, and that was infuriating because by then, I was well established there. I'd set everything up. I was living in Islamabad at my flat. I had lots of friends. I had lots of contacts and was writing lots of things. And suddenly I was arrested and deported. So that was, really heart-wrenching. And to be honest, at the beginning, I thought they would let me back, and so did the Financial Times. But I did the worst possible thing. I had a boyfriend then who was an American journalist living in India, and I went to stay with him. Okay. Pakistan and India hate each other, so all Pakistani media ran stories saying that this proved that I was an Indian agent, that I'd gone straight to my handlers in India. And in fact, I'd gone to Goa for a week at the beach to try and recover. So then I think after that, I wasn't going to be allowed back. So then I moved to London, and then the FT... On staff by this stage? No, I was still freelancing. I was on a retainer. So I was, I guess, what they call a super stringer. And then I, for a while, worked in the Westminster office in London, which was very funny because in Pakistan... How did that feel after having been in Afghanistan? It was fascinating, but I... was so used to in Pakistan just talking to anybody. I mean, you'd just turn up at ministers' houses, and if you wanted to get a quote. So when I went to work in Westminster, I just thought that was how it worked here, because I'd never. And so I was trying to just turn up at ministers' offices and places, and the political editor, I think, was somewhat horrified because I was the most junior person. I wasn't supposed to be doing any of this. So I did that for a bit, but I really wanted to go back abroad. I'd really got the bug, and at that time it was just after the Berlin Wall had fallen. I was desperate to go to Eastern Europe, and the foreign editor called me in, and I had won the Young Journalist of the Year when I was in Pakistan, and I'd then also been part of a team of the FT that won the News Reporter of the Year for an investigation on BCCI. The Bank of Credit and Commerce International, which was a very scandalous bank. And I was getting job offers from other people, but I loved the FT. It was a great place to start off. It was a great place to work, and they were really good to me. I mean, when I look back, they trusted me. They didn't know much about me. I, in Pakistan, was writing quite different things to what was this sort of accepted wisdom, and they printed it.
Yeah.
And, they always used to discuss with me the things. And they had an Asia editor, Robin Pawley, who I really used to talk to a lot. And Ulrich Martin, the foreign editor, was a really amazing encouragement. And so it was a really good place to start out. So I didn't really have any desire to go anywhere else. And it also seemed to me that the FT had more foreign correspondents than any other British paper.
And they sent you to South America?
Well, what happened next? As I said, I was really keen to go to Eastern Europe because this was the time that the Berlin Wall had just fallen. All these different communist regimes were coming to an end. Yeah. And I really wanted to be there. So the foreign editor took me into his office and he said, question I'll never forget, where do you most want to go to in the world? And he had this map with all these coloured pins for his different correspondents, different colours for staff, for superstringers, for freelance. And I said, well, I want to go to Eastern Europe. So at that point, the woman who had been the Eastern Europe correspondent for 12 years, was due to be leaving, which was quite bizarre, really, because it hadn't been a story for most of that time, and suddenly it was a huge story. So I suppose it was quite unlikely, but she had arranged that she was going to be moving. So he said I could go to Budapest and be based there and cover. So I thought that was amazing. I went straight to Hatchard's and bought these books about Hungary and Czechoslovakia. And so I was reading all of these things. And then, of course, the Eastern Europe correspondent then decided she would stay. Right. So then the editor actually called me in and he said, I want to send you to South America. I want to send you to Brazil. Okay. And I had never been to South America in my life. I didn't speak any of the languages, either Spanish or Portuguese. So I said that, but he said, no, it's fine. And they then sent me to Venezuela with the Latin American editor to go and see how it went. And I thought that was great. So then I did a really short course in Spanish and Portuguese and then flew off to Rio.
And how long were you there for?
I was in Rio for almost 4 years and it was wonderful.
I read we don't have time to talk about length, but I read the Carnival piece that you sent, which was fun from that. I was wondering if we could shoot forward a little bit more to talk about the second the Bhutto piece that you sent, so about being on the bus. Because how long before she was killed was that piece was?
So that was Benazir went back to Pakistan in October 2007, and she was killed on Boxing Day 2007. So I think it was about 10 weeks before.
Because I interviewed her when I was at university. It was like one of the first interviews I ever did. I think in 2006, something like that, back at Oxford. So we'll put it in the show notes. But you were on her bus when it was blown up. Could we talk about that, but also about your experience of kind of covering these very traumatic events? What has that experience been like for you professionally and personally, and how have you gone about kind of assimilating that in your work and also more generally as a human being? Yeah,
it's interesting because it's not something people used to talk about. So when I was going into Afghanistan in and out, and lots of you saw, it was the first time I'd ever seen people being killed in front of me, and actually in huge numbers. In the battle for Jalalabad, 10,000 people were killed in a week. I was one of the only journalists there. And also because I was a woman, people were always coming up and asking me, thinking I was a nurse, and asking me to save people's lives, and I felt useless. So, but there was no discussion then about PTSD or the effect on you. And actually, I realised looking back, I remember once coming back from Jalalabad, and it was really shocking, and calling the then foreign editor of the Daily Express to file something, and I started laughing, which was completely inappropriate from what I suppose that was a reaction to the trauma that I had seen. But with Benazir's bus, knew Benazir, as I said, very well. She had this enormous influence on my career. And so when she went back to Pakistan, she asked me to go with her and be on the bus. And first I said, great. But then actually I knew that she'd had lots of assassination threats. And I had just had a number of things happen to me that year. I'd been in a suicide bombing in a hotel. I'd been ambushed in Helmand by Taliban. And so I'd had these various narrow escapes. It was a really weird year. I mean, even I went on holiday with my husband and son, and we went parasailing, and the string broke. So we went crashing down into the sea.
Right.
And my husband was really horrified. And I didn't even realize it wasn't supposed to happen. I just said, oh, that seemed a bit dramatic. And he was like, are you mad? That was like, we could have died. So probably that suggested that I wasn't really reacting quite normally to things. Anyway, I got to Karachi, all the excitement of her going back, and I had decided I wasn't going to go on her bus. I was going to go with the rest of the media on the bus behind, because I knew it was very dangerous. Pakistan then was having more terrorist attacks than anywhere on earth, and she was number one target. So, but then when we got off the plane and we saw all the crowds of people in Karachi gathered around that bus, and I just thought, I have to be there. I have to be on that bus. So I went on top. A few journalists came briefly to do interviews, but I was the only person, along with Victoria Schofield, who's an old school friend of Benazir, who stayed on the bus the whole way. And at the beginning, I thought, this is so dangerous because there are just people everywhere. It's an open-top bus. There are people on roofs, on tops of lampposts and trees. And I said to the guy in charge of security, how are you going to protect her? And he said, well, it's in God's hands.
And then she also stepped away from her bulletproof screen.
Yeah, she did.
Do you think in any way, was she being cavalier? Did she have a death wish? Or do you think...
No, I think she was so excited to be back there, and it's what she loved, being there with the people. And I mean, you saw her whole face and everything change. She was so excited to be back, and the atmosphere was amazing. And as I said, I at the beginning thought this is really dangerous, but then as we started driving and everybody was singing and releasing doves, and there were people with children, and you just forgot the danger in the excitement. And actually, you know, I look back at that and think, what the hell was I thinking staying on that bus? It was crazy. We knew that there was a high chance. And also, Benazir had said to me as we started, the darkness fell, because we were on that bus for 9 hours. She said, have you noticed the street lights are going off as we move forward? Which is something in Karachi notoriously, whenever there was an attack, would happen. Also, all our phones were working, and yet there was supposed to be jammers to block any signals to set off suicide bombs, and clearly they weren't working because we could all call. So there were a lot of, indications that things were not quite right. But you were there for so long, and you caught up in the story, and you forgot. And actually, I feel that that's a time when editors maybe should be saying, actually, is there any point in you still being on there? But the other problem was that we'd arrived in Karachi. All our stuff had been taken off by her handlers. So actually, I didn't have anything with me. And how I would get anywhere, because it was just me, and then there was all these crowds. So how would I get to a hotel? Or we were just in the middle of all this highway.
Did you find that you'd known her for almost 20 years maybe by this stage, and how do you go about writing about someone with whom you had this long and quite intimate relationship? Where do you draw the boundaries between what you're doing?
I think I found that harder at the beginning, when I was first in Pakistan and we were friends, and then she became Prime Minister.
What, 15 years? What was the age gap between you guys?
I guess I think she was 54 when she died. So probably 15 years. And so at the beginning, when I was in Pakistan, so she maybe 13 or 14 years. I think she was mid-30s and I was 21, 22. She became Prime Minister, and she would invite me to things at Prime Minister's house as a friend, which meant that I had tremendous access, but also I found it quite difficult to how do you report on somebody who's actually running the country, but she's sort of inviting you around. And I thought, well, the important thing was just doing my job, so I should write exactly what I saw. And if something bad was happening, as in fact, there was tremendous corruption in her first government, I said to her about all these things. Because I was mostly writing for the Financial Times, I was meeting lots of business people, and they were telling me horrendous stories, particularly about her husband. And so I was asking her about that. I also felt strongly as a woman that she was the first woman prime minister in the Islamic world and in Pakistan, that she should be doing a lot of things for women that needed to be changed, and she didn't do that. And so I did used to have quite heated discussions with her, but she felt, so I still wrote all these things, whereas she felt you're either with us or you're against us, and so if I was a friend I shouldn't be writing these things. So we did fall out, but later on she was actually a very loyal person, and she was in exile in London for years, and so I used to see her here, and so we repaired the relationship.
I wanted to segue, and it's kind of linked to the Malala project. And I read the piece that you wrote about that, and could we talk a bit about your parallel book writing career pre-Malala, and then how the Malala kind of book came about for yourself?
Well, I had always wanted to write books and novels, really. And so right from the beginning, in Afghanistan and Pakistan, it was tremendous material. It was a fascinating time to be there. And I met a publisher actually when I came back from Pakistan, and so was offered a book deal. I couldn't believe it. It was like my dream to write a book, and it was Penguin. I couldn't believe I was going to write a Penguin book, and I was really excited. So I would have paid written for them, and so I wrote my first book, Waiting for Allah, about Pakistan under Benazir and under the dictatorship, and loved doing that. And so really ever since then I've always done books as well as writing for the paper. Well, I'm lucky because actually some years ago when I was hired from the Sunday Telegraph to the Sunday Times, and they offered me more money, and I said, I don't want more money, I want more time.
Right.
So they said, what do you mean? And I said, well, at that point I had a young child, I want to write books as well, and I need more time, so I only want to work half the year. So they were a bit astonished, but I ended up doing a deal which I think I believe works very well for both sides, of working 7 months of the year for the newspaper.
Is it defined as like calendar months? I mean, who determines which months?
No, well, of course, for me doing books, it would be better if I just did 7 months of the paper and had 5 months off for the book. But that isn't how it works. It's much more, I'll go off on a trip for 3 weeks somewhere, then I'll be back for 2 weeks. So those 2 weeks count as my time off. Then I'll go somewhere for a month. It's so sometimes that's difficult because actually, although I love doing both writing for the paper and writing the books, it often takes me time to switch from one to the other. It's quite different.
It's a different muscle.
So usually when I sit down to do the first chapter of a new book after I've been doing lots of journalism, I'll write the chapter and then realize it's only like 2,000 words, and when I would thought I was going to be writing 10,000. And then equally, as I'm sure my editors get very frustrated at the Sunday Times, when I go back to writing for the paper after I've been writing books, I write way too much for the articles. So.
And then for the Malala thing, you were approached, because what I felt very interesting reading that piece was you were kind of very aware of the kind of circus that was around her. And how did you feel kind of observing that, but also maybe partly being part of it and things. I mean, because it struck me that this was all about her, but in a sense, it wasn't about her at all, right? It was like she was a kind of the vortex in the middle of this whole thing, from Angelina Jolie to Bono to, there was a whole like world around this young.
But actually, Malala's very much her own person, and I'd never done a book like that. I'd never done, a ghostwriting or a book where I wrote in someone else's voice or with someone. I'd always written my own things, and then I was approached to do that, and of course I was intrigued to go and meet her. So I went to meet her in Birmingham. She'd just come out of hospital, and they were living in this flat in central Birmingham. And
above these nightclubs.
And it was in the centre of the city, so it was near. Her mum was a bit horrified because at night you'd see all these scantily clad young women. But when I went to talk to her, I had thought the idea of somebody who's got like PR people around them and all these other things was something I didn't want to be involved in. But honestly, the moment that I sat down and met her, she was so amazing. I had never met at that point. She was 16. She was so passionate and eloquent, and also, what she was fighting for was education for young women and boys and girls, which was something I felt really strongly about. I mean, it seemed to me in all these different countries I'd reported from and lived, the one thing that makes most difference is being able to educate people. And so I could see that, she was in such a powerful position to actually speak out about that, but also as a way, I guess, as journalists in these places, you're always looking for stories and people to tell things through. And I had been kind of wanting to write something more about Pakistan and trying to find somebody through which I could bring it all together. And here was Malala, who had been born in 97 and then grown up through this period where her country went through enormous changes after 9/11, and it was the country probably changed more than anywhere else on earth by what happened. And so to be able to write the story of somebody growing up through all of that, and particularly as a young woman and in one of the most conservative parts of the country, and how she had managed to overcome all of that, I just thought was amazing opportunity.
Did you feel any tension between your kind of repertorial instincts and then you're writing for her, right? And in the piece you talk about discussing with the mother whether she can be in it, and it's an authorized production. Did you feel any tension between that ultimately you were sort of part of Team Malala, and in a sense that's different from what journalists' relationship with their subject?
No, because everything that was in the book was, things that we wanted to tell. It wasn't as though we whitewashed something or that there were things that were hidden. Everything that I knew about, because before I met her, I knew all the context because of having been through Pakistan, lived in it and been involved in it for so long and made so many trips there. Then I went to her village, I went to her school. It was kind of like a reporting job as well as, doing all the interviews with her and her family. So it was just that the story was told through her, and I wouldn't have done that book any differently if it had been my book about her rather than a joint book. So, no.
I'd be interested as well on a kind of broader question about what do you feel the impact of your work has been? So, you've written about these events of enormous human important drama. Do you think that your reporting has changed things?
Do you know, that's the hardest question to deal with. Often people talk to me about the trauma of covering things, and I've had colleagues killed, like my colleague Marie Colvin. I've been in lots of places where I've seen terrible things happen. But honestly, the thing I find personally hardest to deal with is, does it make a difference? And when you write about things, I pour my heart into my writing. I try desperately when I'm writing to make people back home think about these places so that they'll change things and, be calling their politicians or be angry and try and get injustices righted. And so when you write about things and that doesn't happen, that's so difficult. And particularly some of the wars that we've been involved with, which never seem to end. So Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria. And we seem to make the same mistakes over and over again. And you just feel like we reported these things. Nobody read what we know what went wrong. And yet the same things are happening. And that's incredibly difficult.
I was thinking with the Yazidi piece, for example, that you sent, which is really very powerful. What kind of impact did that have?
Yeah, I have found myself being more angry, I suppose, in more recent years. And I think that I don't know, it's being older I don't think there's anything wrong with anger. I don't see how you could cover any of this if you didn't care, right? Because it's not... journalism is fun, right? A lot of the time, but a lot of this is really difficult too. And I don't know how you would possibly do it if you didn't really care about the things. Otherwise, you're going through really hard and difficult situations for what? I love writing, and I really feel strongly about a lot of the places that I go to and the people that I meet, and I want people to know about it and to do something. And I feel like, the people in those places can't get their stories out themselves. So I'm trying to tell their stories for them. So, but I think it feels as though in the last few years I've seen more violence against women than I had ever seen in the rest of my career. And I don't understand why that should have got worse. And sometimes I think, I'm more aware of it, but as a woman, I always spoke to the women in these places right from the very beginning. And so I actually genuinely do believe that we're seeing more violence, sexual violence against women in different countries. And I think it's largely because of the impunity. It's so difficult for anyone to get justice for any of this. So most recently I was in the Eastern DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, which has some of the highest levels of rape on earth. And it's just so prevalent. And to the extent that I was talking to some of the people involved in the legal cases, and they're saying to me that the judges that they're working with who are judging cases of sexual violence are themselves abusing children. And sometimes you don't even know where to start in these places.
Again, not just with the sexual violence stuff, but again with these terrible events that you see, how do you police that boundary between reporting and activism? Is that something that you're conscious of?
Yeah. Well, you asked me before about the books. The books are good because obviously one of the frustrations in writing articles is that you can't really explain in great detail things, right? You have to be quite superficial often because you're just so restricted by space. So books are great because then you can actually, tell much more the real story. And I think that's really important. But with the Yazidis, going and seeing these young girls who had been kept as sex slaves and hearing their stories, I'll never forget a girl that I met who'd been taken, a lot of them were taken to Germany to be treated afterwards.
And to quite remote areas.
Yeah, to very remote and in the middle of the forest. And so I went to talk to some of them, and one of them was a 16-year-old girl. And she told me how she'd been taken by this ISIS judge who was very fat and would rape her night after night. And then she said to me, the worst night of my life was the night that he came back with a 10-year-old girl and raped her in the room next door to me as she cried for her mother all night. And, sometimes you listen to these stories, you don't really even know what to say next. You almost don't want to hear what happened next because the stories are so difficult. And you also, you don't want to traumatize people by getting them to tell the stories again of what they've been through. So that, I think, is a difficult issue. But I felt with those girls really angry that nothing people knew, the stories were being reported, but nothing was really being done to help them. The UK, for example, hasn't taken in a single
Did that change after your piece?
No, I wrote about it, and actually, because I was angry, I did do things which I hadn't really done before, and I spoke. I've always, more recent years, have given talks and things, but I sort of spoke in parliamentary committees and things to try and get that changed. And in the end, actually, the book that I'm working on at the moment is about sexual violence in conflict, because it just seemed to me that this is a big subject that people are not really appreciating how bad the situation is, and we should be doing much more about it. And maybe particularly as a woman reporter, I felt more responsibility to be telling these women's stories.
Sure. We're going to have to draw this to conclusion because we're up against our time limit. But Christina, thanks for being such a fascinating guest and covering such a broad swathe of career and terrain, and wishing you all the best with your projects going forward.
Thank you very much.
So, Simon, we're going to focus on you this time.
Are we?
Yes, because I always end up going on and on about my adventures.
That is true.
That are normally quite embarrassing. So I'd quite like to shift the spotlight. What have you been doing?
I have been completing a draft of a long read for The Guardian, which I cannot say what it's about after my editor berated me for mentioning it on Twitter.
Oh.
He says someone else might swoop in and steal the story.
So have you deleted the tweet?
The tweet has been deleted. I finally filed that.
How rigorous is the editing process for a Guardian long read?
It's pretty rigorous.
How many drafts have you been through?
I've just filed the first one, but I think it'll probably go through 2 or 3 more after that. It's a little bit long.
Are you nervous?
No, I've done it before, so I know the editor there. And then been laying the groundwork for a couple of other reporting trips, both to the French Alps, so a piece for Outside, concluding that, and another piece for 1843. So lots of magazine work.
What's the piece for 1843?
I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you. I'm not sure. I'm wary now. I would usually have had no like contrition about discussing it, but after I was like told in block capitals in the subject line of an email, delete your tweet.
Oh my god.
Yeah. So now I don't think I can say.
Right, best not then.
Maybe not.
Is that your first commission for 1843?
It is my first commission for 1843. Yeah, it should be interesting. What about you, Ellie?
What about me?
How was your holiday in Bali?
Yes. Again, I overshared about my drunken night in the larder on the last episode, didn't I? We've had complaints. Yeah. It was a bit of a shit show actually. I don't recommend anyone goes to Bali in only a week if you're trying to visit the Gili Islands.
Because of the jet lag?
No, jet lag was fine. I don't get jet lag, famously. No, you just can't. If there's a storm, the boat's cancelled to the Gili Islands. You just can't basically get there. Well, we did, but we had to. It took us
Gili Islands?
Gili Islands.
Okay.
And each we had to get on a commercial ferry, which ate up 2 days of the holiday, just being on this ferry for like 8 hours.
Sounds like Heart of Darkness.
It was actually horrible. I got chased by a dog, and I'm actually really scared by dogs because I was mauled by one a few years ago.
Okay.
And I got so triggered by it that I
missed your flight.
I lay in a crumpled heap, shaking and crying, and then missed my flight, and then had to pay £600 for a new one at the airport. So yeah, it was not a good holiday. I was not rested. I read half a short story.
Okay.
By Ted Chiang, and that was the most relaxation I had, and even that wasn't relaxing because it was dystopian sci-fi. So that's
there's a moral in this story somewhere, but who knows what it is. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acombe,
and me, Eleanor Halls.
Our producer is Nicola Keane. Our social media is by Zara Hankier. Our score is by Jess Danheiser. Our graphic design is by James Edgar.
You can find us on Instagram at Always Take Notes, or Twitter, Take Notes Always, and we'd be grateful if you could leave a review on iTunes.
And if you've enjoyed the show, please do think about contributing to our crowdfunding campaign. That's patreon.com/alwaystakeNotes. Bye.
Thank you.